librarians. Welcome to episode 269 of School Librarians United. I'm your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 17th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. Friends, I hope you consider joining us for our very next book club. Jarred Amato, creator of Project Lit, has a newly released book. Just read it, Unlocking the Magic of Independent Reading in Middle and High School Classrooms. See the link in today's show notes for the instructions and 14 questions from which you can choose which you'd like to focus your response. You are invited to send your voice message response no later than May 31st. This upcoming episode will be a compilation of all of these listener comments, your reflections, and ways which we can enact this in our library programming and spaces today. Check out the link in today's show notes and be a part of this collaboration. Amanda Jones's upcoming book, That Librarian, will be available starting on August 27th, but you can pre-order your copy now. And if you use the indie bookseller Cavalier House Books in Amanda's hometown of Denham Springs, Louisiana, you will get a signed copy. I've included the link in the show notes. When you look at the cover of Amanda's book, you'll recognize the Freedom Fighter shirt she's wearing. She reached out to the designer, Christy, who then designed a line of That Librarian apparel as well as That Librarian flair, such as a bag, sticker, and mug. I love that we can all be that librarian who advocates for our library and our students' access to books every day. You will find a link to the online store in our show notes. Please note that 15% of all proceeds go to the Texas Library Association, as that is the home state of the designer. Friends, a listener reminded me that I should mention from time to time that you can find in all of our show notes a link to an editable PD certificate. If you are ever in a situation to have some sort of sway over what kind of PD you get during the school year, please know you are always welcome to use listening to this podcast as a point of reflection or a way to earn some professional development credit hours in your district. As always, the podcast is free and available for anyone to use as part of their district PD, whether you're doing this during the school year or the summer. Please know the answer is always yes, and you can find a certificate in the show notes. I'd like to give a shout out to listeners Jennifer in California, Megan in Pennsylvania, Jennifer in Tennessee, Amanda and Sarah in Texas. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me on Facebook, on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at @LMS_United. On Threads, you can find me at School Librarians United, and on Blue Sky at SLU Podcast, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. Be sure to listen to episode 224. I announce a sponsorship with Literati Book Fairs, and now a chance to hear from one of Literati's team members, Jenny. Jenny Powell, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Amy.
Hey, I am so grateful. You have given us such a insider look and sort of behind the scenes to have a better understanding of what you do for Literati. But would you give us a better understanding of how the visual elements of a Literati book fair make it a unique experience both for the kids and for the librarians?
Yes, of course. So not all fairs have themes. This is something that we as Literati will continue to do and feel very strongly about. A new visual theme every season helps kids feel like it's a different fair season after season. And each season also has its own unique illustrator that brings the theme to life on all of the bookcases and posters and bookmarks and pre-fair materials that we provide. There's an immense amount of artistic craft that goes into making all the materials we produce because we want to make our fairs as transformative as possible while keeping everything extremely easy to set up and manage from a librarian's perspective.
Well, and I imagine for our littlest shoppers, many of whom this is one of their first opportunities to really sort of use that independence to go and do some shopping, that you're trying to balance, this exciting experience with something that's familiar. and they feel comfortable going to that book fair because they feel, yes, I feel supported here. This is a space that was created with me in mind.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, that's wonderful. Jenny, thank you so much. I really, truly appreciate it because I know many school librarians, when we are investing our time in having a fundraiser, that it is so important to know that it's going to be successful and that professionals like yourself have done all the work, getting ready so that we can have a truly successful fundraiser each and every time.
Awesome.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
Friends, tune in to learn all about them and their very generous offer. Librarians who book their very first Literati Book Fair and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Visit the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. And now a word from our sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I'm so excited to be working with them. I'm also grateful to Capstone for their continued commitment to support the podcast in Season 6. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now for today's episode, Getting Boys Back into Reading, and my conversation with Lucas Maxwell. Lucas Maxwell, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. I'm really excited to be here again.
This is going to be your fourth appearance on the show. We spoke several weeks ago about your book, Let's Roll, a guide to setting up tabletop role-playing games in your school or public library. Would you care to share what your D&D club is doing heading into the last couple months of school?
Our D&D club, excellent. Yeah. Our heading into the last few weeks of school, we've got, essentially, I've got to be running another, what I call like Dungeon Fest on a weekend. So they're helping me organize that. So that will be about 100 to 120 children in the library on a Saturday, all doing the same little mini adventure that takes around 3 to 4 hours in totality. And it's run by myself, and we have some like celebrity guests and teachers who run it. And then, of course, our older students, and we've got some younger students now, 12, who are taking up the mantle to be dungeon masters to run it. So that is kind of like what we're planning. Also, we've been really exciting. This is breaking news. Myself and my what we call sixth form here, which is basically like 17, 18-year-old students, have been asked to run a Dungeons and Dragons event in June at something called the Barnes Literary Festival, and it's one of the largest literary festivals in Europe. It's like in this beautiful park in London, and they have massive guests, like Quentin Blake, the illustrator of all the Roald Dahl books, is going to be there. Last year they had Cressida Cowell, the author of How to Train Your Dragon, and et cetera, et cetera. It'll be a great experience for them. So we're going to be running D&D events all scattered throughout that day. So we're planning that, and then so it's involved and intense, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah.
Wow. Well, and clearly it wouldn't happen were it not for you making sure that the momentum of this group has a place to go. The kids can channel this energy because you've given a destination for this energy.
Thank you. Yeah.
For them to channel all of that. Your families must absolutely adore you. For listeners who are meeting you for the very first time, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your library. Where are you?
Sure.
And tell us about, we know about the D&D program. You've given us a little idea about that. But I know that you are incredibly important in all the things that happen in your school.
Thank you. I'm a Canadian who's been here in the UK for 10 years, and I'm in what they call high school here in South London, in a borough of London. And in the UK, high school can, in many cases like ours, it's ages 11 to 19. They kind of skip the whole middle grade, junior high kind of situation. So it's a large, well, for me, it's a massive school. It's about 1,800 students, and wide range of, just a massive range of religions, backgrounds, experiences, economics, etc., as you can imagine. So I serve a huge, diverse group of people, which is amazing, and that's been my goal from day one, to kind of just bring programs in to reflect their experiences and things.
Fantastic. You have been a very important part of my virtual PLN. Ever since we started exchanging DMs on Twitter, I had to go and check. November of 2020.
Oh, cool.
Yes, we go back. You and I go back to November of 2020.
I can't believe
Today's episode stems from a blog post you recently shared. Would you tell listeners about the blog, which you have maintained, and how they can subscribe to your newsletters? Because, friend, you share so much on your blog, and I recognize that these are fantastic ideas that we can use. And obviously, we're talking sort of friends in the United States, a middle school, high school resources. You're amazing. The last time we talked, we mentioned that you had published over 150 articles with Book Riot. Those are wonderful. And that I saw you there, and then I realized that you're sharing a lot of your work on this blog that you also support and share so generously on. So let us know. We'll make sure to put links in the show notes, but let listeners in on what you do when it comes to sharing out on your blog.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, the blog I started about 10 years ago as well, and it was just a way at the beginning for me to keep track of monthly statistics on things that I was doing for my manager and things like that. And then it kind of evolved into this thing where I just collected anything that worked for me and share it for free. It's just something I try to make sure is widely available. It's just the name of my school, which is Glenthorne, and I'm sure that can be in the notes or whatever, but glenthorneblog.spot.com. It's just a blog. It's a blogger blog. But how it works is I try to, whenever something interesting or I think is fun or interesting I've done happens, I put it on there, and I have a whole section just for library classes, library lessons, where I do these hour-long library lessons for students. And the newsletter is kind of like subsection of that, where for the past few years I've collected ideas from around the world that I just wanted to find a place where can I find really cool display ideas and program ideas for students, ages 11 plus. And I couldn't really find like a one-stop place. I thought, well, I'll just create one. So I started this newsletter that is free. I've got about 550 subscribers now, which I'm really grateful for. And I email that out once a month. And it basically is 6 pages on a PDF, and each page, 5 pages have ideas, just program ideas or something you could try, or display idea, or just something cool. And then the last page is simply a book recommendation, usually one of the most popular books in the library, in my library at least, or something that I've read recently that is really cool. So anyone who wants to kind of learn more about that, the best way really is on social media. I'm on social media on all platforms, I guess. It's just my name. It's at Lucas J. Maxwell, and you can find me on anything there and get in touch and get links to all that stuff.
Well, and friends, I can't overstate the importance. I'm so aware that educators across our profession have the option to always put things behind a paywall or just not even share. There's a certain obvious ownership to the things that we create. And when I'm very aware when especially school librarians make those things readily available to our community, I can't tell you how much it means to so many of us who, unlike you, I'm relatively new to this age group. I appreciate anytime somebody puts material out there that we can all learn from. We are better together. So I'm very grateful. And like I said, you've been a part of my PLN since actually before I taught high school, and I was looking to make a change. And I was like, I want to learn from school librarians who do their jobs and feel so strongly about what they do, that you were definitely a role model for me, whether you realized it or not.
I definitely didn't realize it.
Which brings us to the reason why we are chatting today. April 2nd, you posted a fantastic article, 5 Ways to Encourage Boys to Read for Pleasure. I imagine that this article is one that you've had in the works for a long time.
Yeah, I always think about this kind of thing. I've been asked, and I'm very grateful that we're on our Easter break here in the UK. But when I return next week, I've been asked to speak to another school leadership team that's visiting our school, and I'm very grateful that they asked me to speak to them on how to get boys into reading. I think it's something that they're seeing at their school, they're struggling with. And as I said, I mean, in the blog posts, I believe I did anyway, if I look at like the monthly stats, boys borrow more than than girls. But again, I can go into that more, but it doesn't mean they're reading it, but they're definitely borrowing more. They're definitely borrowing more, and they're definitely engaged a lot. So, and I have things that I think as a reason why, but yeah, so that it is something that's been on my mind for a while, definitely.
I had some things that I wanted to make sure we I don't want to clear the air, but I know that when listeners hear, when we identify things as we're talking about boys and we're talking about girls, and it's so easy to all of a sudden have some questions that might or might not make their way into our conversation. First of all, friends, I want to make sure that this is not a conversation about what constitutes a boy book or a girl book. Because I'll tell you from personal experience, 14 years working in the elementary libraries, because my students, it was regularly heard, oh, that's a girl book, that's a boy book. If a book had a pink cover or a purple cover, if there was a princess on it or a unicorn, all of a sudden, you have to realize as the adults in the room that we have to make sure our students feel comfortable checking out whatever book you want, and to make sure that when students start to go down that path, that we bring them back to a space where everybody says, you know what, you can check out whatever you want. So that was huge. I mean, is that really, I haven't really encountered that so much overtly at dealing with older students. Have you?
No, it isn't really an issue with that kind of thing. And yeah, as you just said, we're not really here to say this is a boy's book or girl's book. One of the most popular books in our school at the moment is a book called Crater Lake, which is a UK, which I hope it makes it over to you at some point. It is amazing. It's about a grade 6 or year 6 end of the year kind of school trip to a camp, and it's a nightmare. And it's like a mixture of Friday the 13th, Aliens, and the trip goes horribly wrong. It's written by Jennifer Killick. She's an amazing kind of author, does these comedy / it's a mixture of comedy and horror, which is really cool. A boy main character written by a female author, but it is super popular with girls. The gut reaction is, oh, maybe it's a bit surprising because it is quite gross out, and maybe that in stereotypical old man fashion, in my head, maybe girls don't want that kind of thing. But it's not true. It's just about how funny and engaging it is. There is no such thing, as you just said, as a girl book or boy book. And if you're of a certain age, you have that in your head, maybe, like I do, at least. But it's been beaten out of me, because it just doesn't compute anymore.
Exactly. I know I'm not alone in moving away from gender and the pronouns which are used as a way to distinguish people I encounter on a day-to-day basis. I support trans students, non-binary students and staff. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that while we, at least in my day-to-day, gender doesn't come up, and yet in the literature, and when I look at especially reading literature with reading teachers and reading specialists, in books that I've encountered on how to generate a reading culture, you acknowledge there is a gender gap. And this is something that is well documented, especially when you talk about reading and the reading habits. And it's not just an American thing. I understand it to be outside of, especially in research that I've read coming out of Australia and the UK. So, I mean, it's not just limited to us.
No, I mean, I don't think the research is caught up with pronouns, because every time I'm looking at research here in the UK, it's just saying boys versus girls. And as you said, in our school, we fully accept and support and love our all the students who whatever pronouns they are using or decide to use. The library, of course, is for everyone. You know, it's a term. You know, libraries are for everyone is something that's out there all the time. But I'm not just creating that, of course. But it is hard if I'm clicking on buttons to look at data on our library catalog. I can't choose pronouns. I can't choose other than boy, girl, boy, girl. So that's why in the blog post I wrote those who identify as boys. It is very, very hard to do at this current time. I know you, and you know your students who are using different pronouns, and I know the students are coming in who have asked to be addressed as they or whatever, and we do that. But on paper, they're still being labeled, and that is tricky. That is very, very tricky, and I don't feel like I'm the expert on it, but it's or on how to, how we convince the powers that be that to make sure. I mean, our leadership team is amazing at it, but it just hasn't translated to the research around it. So when I'm looking at like when they call gender gaps, reading gaps, part of what spurred on the idea that I should write this, there's a great charity here called the National Literacy Trust, and they saw that here in the UK, under half of youth they looked at ages 8 to 18. They kind of surveyed thousands of people. I mean, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a huge number. Very few said that they enjoyed reading in their spare time. And it's been the lowest level here in the UK since, like, for over 20 years. And then on top of that, they've looked at boys versus girls, and boys were even lower, So that's kind of spurred me on. Why are boys engaging boys, those who identify as boys or as male in our library? Why are they borrowing more, and why are they engaging more? So I just thought, I don't have like a magic bullet answer, but here are the things that we're doing. Maybe there's some insight into it.
Another sort of caveat or something that I sort of want to throw out there for the benefit of listeners is, it occurred to me that much like UDL, Universal Design for Learning, whenever we implement changes to improve a situation in our space, there are going to be other populations who benefit from these efforts, such that the strategies we're discussing today are likely going to benefit all our readers and encourage more reading for pleasure, regardless if our readers are identifying as male or female.
Absolutely. And at the top of that post, I always stress that all the things I'm discussing benefit everybody, seem to benefit everybody. But if I'm looking through the lens of comparing our school to like the national average, which we seem to be different than what some other schools, or quite a significant number of schools, households or whatever, are experiencing, I'm just kind of looking at why that is. So absolutely, if you're looking at space, so one thing like I talked about was creating a dedicated manga space, which visually, a break before school, break and lunch and after school, is flooded with boys. A lot of them are kids that I will see in library lessons maybe, or I don't think I would see, I don't think if I had that space, I'd see them in the library at all, if that makes sense. Just because they go there, they are glued to these soft seats and they are glued to that section, and that's all they will read, which is fine. That's amazing. But I'm so lucky that I've got that space and that they'll sit there and engage, because I honestly think that they would just not be bothered to come in if that wasn't there. Girls, those who identify as girls, borrow tons of manga. I'm wondering if I had even more space, would they sit there? But it's it just seems to be this little, almost like a little impromptu manga club that they sit there and they just chat, and they're really great. They just sit there and quietly read. And if I had permissions, we are not, I won't go into it too much, but our staff, we're not allowed to have like phones out, and like staff, adults aren't even allowed to have phones out. So if I was allowed to like take my phone out and like with their permit, like without like blocking their faces. I would love to have like a panning shot and just have them. I think about it all the time. Like if I could pan them and have like a video and just have like a caption to say, boys don't read anymore, like something sarcastic, it's just because they do, like they just read in droves. They're just there in these huge clusters and just reading. It's really great to see.
Well, it's sort of a if you build it, they will come, sort of a field of dreams. This idea that if you create the collection that your students want, and friends, we have done entire episodes on how Lucas promotes and raises the profile of what he does. Raising the profile of the library and the librarian still remains one of the top 10 downloaded episodes of all times. But you are an absolute magician when it comes to making sure that people cannot ignore you. I want to start off and talk about your non-negotiables, because you mentioned that in order for these 5 strategies to work, 3 things have to happen. You have to have a dedicated library space. You have to have a librarian, preferably a professionally trained, certified school librarian, and you have to have a dedicated budget. Now, I got to tell you, if you don't have one of those, it's going to be real hard. If you don't have 2 of those, it's going to be, incrementally more difficult to do this. Now, I will be honest, I have friends who do not have a dedicated library space. They are either in transition, they are in the middle of a construction project where their school is being just completely rebuilt someplace else. They work out of temporary trailers where they have to work with a much smaller library. I've worked with friends who are, in some cases, their colleagues are not certified trained school librarians. Their colleagues are clerks who are learning. I've also worked with librarians who do not have a budget. So I don't for 1 minute assume that our listening audience has all 3 of these things.
I have been asked this kind of thing before, and I'm extremely lucky because I kind of fell into this position here in the UK, having zero idea what it was like. And from day one, the leadership was, I wasn't like given tons of money to begin with or anything like that, but it was supported anyway from the beginning. And I was very naive. I didn't realize, I thought, oh, it's like this everywhere in the UK, must be. And then I learned really quickly that it wasn't. And so I'm not saying that it's easy and you can just snap your fingers and get these 3 things. I think something that we struggle with, and I struggle, at least I've struggled with, and that's why I wrote that post we discussed about raising the profile, because I think that plays into it. If they understand the value that we can bring, that plays a huge role in the budget. And I'm not saying those librarians who don't have a budget aren't doing a good job at that, because there's always other factors. Here in the UK, I sometimes do get frustrated when I hear about schools or librarians who lose their budget, because I think that the leadership is not fully understanding the value of the library and the librarian. And in some cases, not every case, I feel like we have to do a lot of work, extra work, to prove our worth. And again, I'm not saying that they aren't doing that, but because leadership changes and different things happen, and it's really tough, because it can be also, if you're on your own, very isolating, very difficult. You are overwhelmed and swamped all the time. But my argument always is that the money is often there. It's just they don't realize that they should be putting it in your hands, in my opinion. And this is my opinion. I'm happy to be shot down on that, because I know that it's probably a wide swath generalization, but I always struggle with that, because I think we are often personality types as well, in many cases, here in the UK at least, that I've found, aren't the type to be shouting about our achievements all the time. And I struggle with that, but I've kind of like just overcome that shyness or whatever by just saying, these are like, by doing what I'm doing, like speaking with you and blogging about successes and things like that, and being on social media, and has led to our leadership taking more notice, if that makes sense. But it took me years to do that, but yeah, it's hard.
I am very aware that it is not unusual for the building administrators to quickly figure out that one of the things we come to them for is money. I've had the opportunity to introduce myself to my new administration. You want to prioritize the things that you say to your brand new administrator, and money's always part of that conversation. And forgive me, but I don't think necessarily the other 87 teachers I work with that money is always going to be in that conversation. It might be something that costs money, like a program, but they're not coming for a budget. And we do. Your math program might have a budget, but if you have an algebra teacher, it's unlikely that one of the first things they're going to do when they meet the new principal is ask for money.
That is 100% true, and so they are going to be they're going to be set up, quote unquote, the teachers, because they have to do their job. But for us to do our job, for some reason, we have to argue and fight tooth and nail. Mm-hmm. Often it is
absolutely
it is really hard. Yeah, and I empathize with everybody because I wish I had better answers for that.
No, but I'm going to tell you right now, I don't take for granted that everybody I talk to has all three things.
Yes.
I don't.
No.
So, no. And as somebody who has worked for years, missing one of those, you have to recognize that we all have challenges to certain degrees. I've yet to meet somebody who says, my job is perfect and I don't have any struggles.
No,
it's not out there.
Absolutely.
So friends, you should definitely make time for this article. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. You always are so generous with whatever you share. And I learn so much every time I read from you. I'm not even jealous because at this point you write beautifully. And I'm never going to do that. Let's go touching upon the things that you say, and you've already started to talk about having one of the most, and I assume you listed it first because it is probably one of the most impactful things you've done to your space, which is a dedicated manga space with your shelves full of manga. So you mentioned just briefly about the physical space. If I walked into your library, and someday I hope to, but where would I see this destination? Because it sounds like it's bringing in a lot of foot traffic.
Yeah, it's not massive. It's not big, but this manga section, so you come in the library, you go down about 3 steps, and then another 3 or 4 steps, and you got the semicircular information desk, and then immediately, the first thing that hits you to your left as you go down the steps, our manga shelves, and we got a beanbag chair in front of that, and then about 6 or 7 soft seats, comfortable seats, and then some other seating area, and those are filled, and then the floor is filled with them, and they pull these manga off and they have them in stacks on the little low-lying tables and the bean bags, and they just sit and read Pokemon ones and the Zelda ones and Naruto and etc. That is that. It's like the first thing. Very lucky that the library is the first thing you see when you enter the school, and then the first thing you see when you enter the library is this manga section, really. And it's a kind of a very open, it's an all open space, but that's the first thing that catches your eye, and that just brings in so much traffic. As you just said, they just zoom around that little corner of that stairway, and off they go. Yeah, it's right there.
Can I just a couple things I wanted to mention. First of all, friends, thanks to other manga and graphic novel enthusiasts, we do have a graphic novel manga playlist, which I will include in our show notes. I have a playlist collection which we regularly add to, and one that specifically speaks to graphic novels and manga in our collections. Can I ask you, Lucas, when it comes to building out and allocating money for this particular part of your collection, do you formally solicit suggestions from your students, or is this sort of, throughout the day, students ask you and that gets added onto the list of things you prioritize when it comes to spending?
I'll use the student voice. I think I told the story before, but my very first week in the library 10 years ago, I put out a clipboard and a piece of paper that just said, give me your book suggestions or something like that. They didn't need to provide any names or anything like that. It was just titles or whatever. And somebody kept persistently doing this, taking like a black marker, board marker, and just wrote buy more manga, like across it, a giant thing. and ruining my list. So I got the hint because when I first arrived, all we had were like, I think the collection of Death Note, but money were missing, and that was it. And now we have hundreds. So I do in our manga club. I have like a Padlet where they can add books that they want me to buy and things like that, and I use that and I just their opinions and things like that. And so I use a lot of student voice, and because I'm not a manga expert or anything like that, I do read the first few and get a sense of it, but I don't consider myself like a super fan. But you have some amazing librarians in the U.S. Her name's escaping me. You might remember, but
we have a couple who've been on the show.
I'm sure.
Jillian Rudas,
yes,
and Ashley Hawkins.
I've talked
and
to
Julie
Ashley.
Stivers.
Yeah, they are amazing, and I use them unashamedly to help me with my collections because, as I said, I'm not an expert. They are like obsessed in amazing ways, like in a good way, and they know what they're talking about. So I use them. Yeah.
When I do have money to spend, I refer to the resources they share, and friends, I'll be sure to link those in the show notes. Can I ask you, you mentioned a manga club. Is it sort of ad hoc? It just sort of forms this group that informally appears in your space after school? For a long time, when I talked to Julie Stivers, she had an anime club that was meeting regularly and a sort of a watch party. But do you have anything formal that you do with your friends, your students who enjoy this part of the collection?
Our manga/anime club is the longest running club we've had. It's 10 years in the running, and it is every Thursday at lunch. It used to be after school, but I changed it to lunch. And it's run also by older students. It's not a club where we read manga together because we have 11-year-olds and we have 17-year-olds. So it's one of those things where you just couldn't read the same thing. But we do a mixture of quizzes, crafts. We watch like Studio Ghibli films. We do just games, a lot of games. Trying to think of ones like Exquisite Corpse, where you are drawing different things, but it's all manga related. I do like a manga Jenga thing, which is tricky, but it's fun. And then all kinds of different things all around manga, but a lot of games and prizes and things like that. But yeah, we have a very dedicated club.
Fantastic. Your next suggestion in increasing the number the traffic that you're getting and the number of checkouts you're getting from your students who identify as being boys, you mentioned especially your nonfiction and creating activities around them. Can you expand on that? Because in my head, I'm thinking nonfiction, but I'll be honest, at the high school level, I don't do as much in terms of the nonfiction checkouts. But can you tell us what works in your space that's been so successful?
What works is I'm lucky that ages 11, 12, and 13 all come in for every 2 weeks for a library class or lesson that is an hour long that I lead. Kind of brought in their English teacher brings them in, but I run the lesson. And through that, I've been able to highlight our nonfiction collection. And when I said nonfiction, there's one called Believe It or Not, and there's not Believe It or Not, but it's an urban legend book. Oh my God, I'm blanking on. But we do Ripley's Believe It or Not as well. Two things. I do nonfiction scavenger hunts, which is essentially a big pile of books that are all nonfiction, and it's a race. So they're in tables or in groups of 4 or 5, and they get little question sheets, and the questions have the names of the books. They have to run up, grab a book, answer the question. The question requires them to use different parts of a nonfiction book, like glossary and table of context, indices, and things like that. Things that young people, unfortunately, are losing kind of connection with mobile phone use and things like that, in my opinion. Bibliographies and things like that. It's a good way to introduce them to these things. So they have to answer these little questions. And when they answer the question, they write their answer down and they rush up, they grab another book, they put their book back, and the first group that gets all the books finished wins a prize, usually something small, but also then we go over all the answers and things like that. And then I do, it highlights our new nonfiction, no matter what it is. We have, tons of them. But again, they don't circulate unless those books will circulate after that lesson, but without that kind of really heavy promotion. And I get to see over a course of 2 weeks, I see about 1,000 kids almost in these lessons. So those books are going to move because there are kids who are like, oh, that book exists, books about weird facts from around the world, no matter what it is. And then I do these kind of like misinformation lessons where they're given different books about conspiracy theories, the ones that are like older conspiracy theories, books on like cryptozoology and things like that. And they are given like different stories and news headlines and things. They have to work out which ones are real and not real. And again, just highlighting the books, and then that always piques their interest. And then not necessarily, it is a nonfiction in a way, but it's more historical fiction. The I Survive series, which are from the US by Lauren Tarshish, are really popular with us because I do these lessons around them where they get to create their own. They get to pretend they've been like sucked into a time warp and put in the middle of a disaster. They do research on Britannica, and they create their own little comic book panels and things like that. Because we have the graphic novel collection of I Survive, which are amazing. And they love those. They really love it, especially the shark attack ones and all that, the scary ones. They absolutely love them, the World War II ones and things. So those are the ways that we do it, really, through those lessons.
Well, and I love that all of these lessons are based on physical resources you have in the library, which means that even if they don't check those books out that day, that those will be, the more you do these lessons, the more familiar they are with the resources. I think it was one of the first realizations I had as a school librarian that I was never going to lack for resources because I was literally in the center of the school where all the resources were together, the physical resources. And then I realized, the digital resources. And, it was a wonderful realization. But I imagined that even though you mentioned some of these books are, Lauren Tarshish does a lot of, ones that are based in American history, wouldn't it be fascinating to then build upon, the history, which is, forgive me, much longer in the UK. And you could have students. I mean, your students are so clever. They are so creative. I'm thinking about all of the ones who are responsible for the stories that are built in your D&D group. Well, why don't you look to the actual history of the UK? And it's absolutely fascinating where they could go with that. We have this short little history here in the United States, and you're looking at the history of it's considerably older. I know
the Scholastics missing a trick there. They could easily get in on that. I know it's something that they should.
I don't know. There's an aspiring author out there who's Lauren Tarshish adjacent, and who might take that sort of dare I say formula.
That formula.
And work with it.
Absolutely. We need it.
You heard it here. That idea is free. Somebody else take it.
You can take it.
Let's talk about choice. I've done entire episodes on choice, but you are talking to a bunch of very, you're singing to the choir here. When it comes to student choice, I think sometimes the one thing I have to work with is the recognition that teachers have parameters. Teachers, when they bring their students down to their space, and obviously your teachers have worked with you for a long time. You've been there for 10 years. I haven't. And the more I learn about teachers, the more I'm learning about some of their expectations when it comes to the books that the students are going to check out. Let's talk about, when it comes to choice, have you had to have some of those conversations with your colleagues when it comes to the books that the students are checking out?
Yes, absolutely. So at the beginning, I would often have students come in and they would check a comic book out, and they would come back middle of the lesson maybe and say, my teacher said to get a real book, or my teacher said wasn't allowed to read this or whatever. It happens sometimes with like Wimpy Kid, and happens with comic books. I'm sure everyone's heard that story. And I think what's helped for me is, and we've talked about, maybe we'll talk about this later, but speaking in like big groups to teachers. And I'm very, very lucky that, so we have we're kind of a unique school in that we have, we're not a private school or anything, but we have this unique training program where teachers are trained within our school and they go off to other schools. So we have this own inbuilt-in training system where they get really, really great training to be a UK teacher as part of their degree, and then they go off into the world. Sometimes they stay at our school, but sometimes they go off. But I am asked by the senior leadership to talk to these teachers, no matter where they go in the UK, about the importance of reading for pleasure. And I always stress how important comic books are and how you have to ignore the kind of what I just call snobbery, because there's a huge amount of snobbery around it. And so I have had those conversations. I'm always very positive about it because I'm glad that they're engaging with their reading, and that kind of concern about them not being real books comes from somewhere that in their childhood or whatever. I don't know, maybe they heard it when they were being trained as a teacher or whatever. Fact of the matter is that, as you know, like comic books use a lot of complex language. They are huge stepping stones for students. And some students will read comic. And I talk about, when I speak in assemblies where I have these huge audiences, like over 1,000 kids, I talk about that. I would read comics, I'd read nothing but Punisher comics. So I wasn't supposed to be reading them, I'm sure. They were so hyper violent. And, but that's what kept me, that's what kept me reading as a kid. I would read other stuff eventually, like these D&D type novels, but I loved comics, and I was lucky that no one told me not to read them, but they are what kept me going in a big sense. So I always talk about them in a positive way.
Well, and I definitely want to talk about your all-school assemblies, because I am blown away by the fact that you get to address them on a regular basis. Let's, go back to this idea of the conversation that you're having with your teachers. Friends, many of you remember Dr. Steve Tatro, who's been on the show many times, but our first conversation was about literacy shaming and this idea that some books just don't have the value that other books do. And I know recently in a conversation I had with Lori Lieberman about her romance book club, because there are definitely people who have decided that some genres of books are more literary and have higher literary quality than others. And so, it's important, because when we see our students reading, I'm very cognizant not to impose some sort of value to what it is. It's always a positive response that I have, and I'm not going to in any way try to disparage something as being, oh, you're just reading that for the dirty part, or you're just reading that for the smut, or you're just reading that because it has, naughty words in it. I remember my littles were very aware. They said, Mrs. Harmon, this book has swears in it. This book says HE double hockey sticks. And I was like, yup. Honestly, my littles just thought that was so scandalous. Honestly, the important thing is that they found something they love, and we have to be supportive of that. Could you talk a little bit about the author visits? Because I think in your space, the author visits have really motivated your students in a way that, I can't appreciate if I haven't brought authors in to speak to my students directly.
Author visits have a massive impact. I mean, again, I'm extremely lucky that we get to bring authors in. I'm fully aware that some people here in the UK, especially, I know lots of librarians. Like, we can get one author a year. Maybe they get one virtual visit a year, and that's it. And we are lucky we get a few more. But again, going back to the National Literacy Trust, who have done amazing work on this to show the actual impact, because I always knew that it had an impact, but I didn't have the resources to kind of go, how can I kind of like put this in a meaningful kind of format or pie chart or whatever. But the Literacy Trust, again, over a series of years and surveying thousands of teachers and students, has shown that students who receive or who engage with authors, who have authors visit their schools, their attitude towards reading is hugely higher than those who haven't had an author visit. And sadly, what we're seeing here in the UK, which is no surprise, of course, is those who are living in more deprived areas, and students on what we call here in the UK free school meals. So students who are living at an economic level where they are receiving free meals at school are the ones who don't receive author visits. So huge numbers of kids in the UK did not receive an author at all, or did not have an author, I should say, visit their school. I think it's the numbers are extremely high across the board. And an author, the impact of that author. So if I want to think of an author like, I talked about Jennifer Killick, and I'll talk about an author here in the UK called Lily Bailey, who She is someone who writes books, and I hope they make it across the U.S. because they are amazing, and they are about they're middle grades, and they're about a boy. The first one is called When I See Blue, and it's about a boy who has obsessive compulsive disorder, and the author herself is very open about her OCD and how it impacted her and how it impacts this boy in her novel. And when she came to the school, she was an amazing visitor, and I could see there were like 11-year-olds in the audience that she was talking to, and I could see them getting like, when she was talking about being dyspraxic and having OCD, I could see the students getting like restless or something, which was odd because they're amazing kids, but I could just see this weird ripples of like them just getting really, really restless. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And then she just kind of like stopped and asked the boy in the back, do you want to say something? Because he was like desperate. And all they wanted to do was just they were just one after another. Like they wanted to talk about their, I'm dyspraxic or I'm autistic, and I have obviously, like, they have their own diagnosis that they wanted to talk about. And then this is in the big hall, and then at the end I said, if you want to meet Lily and get a book signed or just say hello, come to the library, of course. And I've never in 10 years seen an impact. And again, boys and girls. And the line for that to meet her was out of the library into the courtyard. And it just took ages. It went all through our break and into the next lesson. They missed the whole next lesson. There was so many kids.
That's a good problem, right? That's a good problem to have. But
yeah.
Wouldn't you say that the author brings that authenticity, that authenticity of the writing, that you feel that you are reading into that author's lived experience on some level?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was like, I could go back to when I was a kid, we never had any authors visit in where I was in Canada, and I always just assumed they were all millionaires and lived on the like. I didn't even know how you could become an author. Like, it wasn't anything that I thought was even possible. I thought they were all these just gods, untouchable people, and they humanize it. And when you get someone like Jennifer Killick, who I talked about, who wrote Crater Lake, and she's standing in front holding her book, saying, talking about the people who told her she would never be an author. And telling these kids, these 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds, you can do this. This is not unachievable for you. Don't let anybody tell you, because she's had that experience herself where people told her. And that, as you just said, that brings that moment to a fine point where they're like, oh, this is, I can do this. If I wanted to be creative, I could become an author. Yeah, it was amazing.
Fantastic. And friends, your third suggestion, we dedicated an entire conversation to, and that is the Let's Roll and the role-playing games, and in this case, Dungeons and Dragons, has been a remarkable way to bring in a great deal of sort of a dedicated, loyal following of students. And friends, if you haven't listened to Lucas's episode called Let's Roll about his book and his D&D program, I can't recommend this highly enough. It is so incredibly impactful because you recognize that you have something of a cult following. And I mean that in a respectful way. I think your students adore you. That's for sure. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this next criteria for making sure that you inspire and sort of bridge some of this gender gap that some people might be experiencing. And that is reading aloud. It can't be overstated because in this conversation, we're talking about secondary students. And I think that there's a likelihood across many educators thinking that once our students become independent or capable of reading to themselves independently, that the importance of a teacher or a teacher person like a librarian reading out loud all of a sudden becomes less valuable because our students presumably can read to themselves.
As you just said, there's a huge misconception that you should stop doing it once they get out of what here is called year 6 or like primary or elementary school. That it just doesn't need to be done. I don't understand that at all. And the kids that I read aloud to absolutely love it. And we read aloud in the library pretty much every single day, and I read aloud to them. And the example in the blog was that there is this amazing book. Again, I don't think it's in the US yet, but it should be. It's called Steady for This, and it is. And I read a page, and I should have anticipated it, but I did it. I literally did it I wasn't going to read aloud from it. And 10 seconds before I went in front of like over 1,000 kids, I was like, I'm just going to do it. I don't know. I just thought, to be perfectly blunt and honest, the reason why I did it was the teacher told me how much time I had, and it was more time than I expected. So I was like, actually, I got to kill some time, and I'll read from this. But I just didn't think I had as much time. But I was going to promote it anyway. But it's essentially about this kid who he's just desperate to be a famous rapper, and he's got a friend, and he's got the nickname and this and that. But he just falls down all the time. As in just fails at this stuff all the time. And he decides he's going to live stream a rap from his bedroom. And in the middle of doing this with his friend, his mom comes in and basically holds up his dirty underwear. But the way he writes it is so embarrassing. And in these whole school assemblies, there's so many kids. They're supposed to be dead quiet. And I could see them like trying not to laugh. And I was doing like, I was really hamming it up and doing it, and it worked. And then that book, I should have had 20 copies on the shelf. They would have borrowed every single one. It's on this huge waiting list now, but it is absolutely hilarious, but also deals with, because of this live stream gone wrong, what it's like to be bullied, he just destroyed online, and how it impacts him and his mental health. But there's moments throughout it that he just is so funny, and it's such an amazing book. So Steady for This by Nathaniel Lasore, I would recommend it. But yeah, reading aloud in that sense, and also in library lessons, we read aloud like Choose Your Own Adventures, which we read aloud, and they choose, the class votes to choose which path we take and things like that. All different ways to do it. Kwame Alexander, poetry novels, things like that you can kind of like get a lot completed in a short time. Really effective in drawing people in and getting them interested in those books.
So I think it's vitally important that they hear and they listen, because it requires a certain amount of attention on their part, but it also helps them with reading stamina, and it helps them motivate them to realize that if they stick to this, they're going to be able to that there's a reward in learning to become a stronger reader. And I love this idea because, if I'm not mistaken, am I correct that your principal has also read out loud to this assembly of 1,000 students? Friends, never have I ever addressed a group of 1,000 students. Why? Because I have never had this ability to compel my building leadership to say, you know what we should do is give the mic to Amy. I
don't know why that happened to me. My very first, the second day on the job, I read in front of the entire school body. They asked me to read a poem, and I did. It was like last minute as well. But yes, the head teacher has read aloud. They have weekly what they call whole school assemblies. Our school is so big now, they're split into two, but the first one is about 1,000 kids, and the second one's about 800 kids, 700 or 800 kids. So they do Monday and Tuesday. I read for the older kids, I read from Fahrenheit 451, because I was doing a whole thing because they find the book banning, I don't know what to call it, the fiasco that happens in the U.S. Quite fascinating, because it doesn't really happen here, knock on wood. It has happened in very, very small amounts, but the explosion of it happening in the U.S. they find it quite amazing and just mind-boggling that someone would come to their school library and tell the librarian that they couldn't have a book on the shelf. So I talk about that a lot, and how lucky we are. And I read from Fahrenheit 451, of course, because it's very, very relevant. There are lots of things going on. And that was the older kids. And that was quite powerful, in my opinion, because you could hear a pin drop, of course, and they kind of came in the library afterwards, a lot of them, to talk about it and borrow it, of course. But yeah, our head teacher has read different passages. I've had high-level senior leadership ask me for like a great passage from a book to read about certain topics, because they always do different themes and topics and things like that. So I'm really lucky that way. And I was, here we go. If they're doing something on sports or something on, disability aware, being empathetic towards, disabilities and showing representation and things like that. So yeah, I've been really lucky. That's happened a lot, actually. Yeah.
Well, I will say the one thing that I love reading to students before we leave for our summer break is Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and especially the chapter with Mike TV. I think I don't want to get this wrong, but basically, friends, the Oompa Loompas, those lyrics are all written in the actual book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and the whole diatribe on what happens when you're watching TV, and this vice that we have of watching TV is hilarious. And I read it to my older students, and they were like, the same thing. I said, folks, this was written, at this time, we're talking about, I think it was written in the 60s. I'm not quite sure when Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But here he was sounding the alarm about our students staring at a screen. And you could use the same thing for our students today. It's just as true. Lucas, I think it's also important that we mention that these strategies all take time. In many cases, they take money to have their desired effect. You have been in your space for 10 years, and you have the success to show for the commitment that you have in all of these efforts. We're playing the long game. And this investment is so vital if we are to support a culture of reading, and our students are going to become lifelong readers.
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, as you said, it is a long, long game because it takes a lot of time and effort, but it's worth it, as you said, because everything you just said, because not only is it, first and foremost for the students, but as we've talked about, part of your job as a librarian is to also show the staff and the school body that you are what you're there for, and that you're an important part of really important part of the student's success in life and in school. And that also takes a lot of time. So that's been great to see that as well. But as you said, it's a slow game.
Lucas Maxwell, I know listeners will want to include you in their virtual professional learning networks, as I have. I'm going to make sure to include your contact information in our show notes. If people want to follow you on social media, what is your preferred platform?
Preferred platform would be X at the moment, but I'm on Instagram as well. Everything I'm on is at Lucas J. Maxwell. But X is probably where I'm the most active, I would say. I like to share a lot of stuff on there. So yeah, that would be it.
Well, and friends, it's enough for us to sit down here and talk for an hour. You're on your Easter break, and I want you to go back to enjoying your time off with your family. Lucas Maxwell, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks so much. Really grateful for you to invite me. Thank you.
Friends, before we wrap up today's episode, I wanted to revisit a few things I said because they didn't sit well, and especially after editing this conversation, I realized I needed to perhaps add a few explanations. As you can tell, while my interview questions for these conversations are always planned out in advance, my responses are less so. So please accept these addendums. Addenda is also acceptable at this time. First of all, when it comes to the experts featured on this show in the category of graphic novels and manga, I wanted to also make sure I mentioned Sarah Smith, and episodes 100 and 200, and whose graphic library blog is my absolute go-to when making purchasing decisions. You'll find Sarah Smith, Julian Rudas, Ashley Hawkins, and Julie Stivers in the graphic novel, manga, and anime playlist, which is linked in the show notes. Also, I stated that the United States had a much shorter history than that of the UK when talking about the Can You Survive stories. And yes, while the United States as a nation is relatively young, in comparison, I did not mean to disregard the indigenous people who inhabited this land for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the Europeans, and I wanted to apologize for my oversight. Friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you find us. Reviews help others find us. A couple friendly reminders, friends. Use the code UNITED to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more. And listeners who are booking their very first Literati Book Fair and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Visit the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. Friends, I hope you consider sending in your voice messages and have your say on the very next podcast episode, which we broadcast. Visit the link in today's show notes and be sure to check out the instructions and the 14 prompts to Jarred Amato's brand new book, Just Read It. You too can be part of our episode, which is going to be broadcast later this spring. And I've asked listeners who would like to participate and send in their voice recordings that they do so by May 31st, so we can have enough time to put those recordings all together and have this shared experience of having a book club, albeit remotely, on the podcast. The topic of our next episode will be What to Do When You Are New and my conversation with Sarah Sansbury. I hope you will tune in.